Welcome to Four Elements of Use of Self, part of our webinar series on leading collaborative innovation. My name is Russ Gaskin. I'm with Co-Creative, and I'm excited to have you all join us today. A little bit about Co-Creative. We are a consultancy that supports multi-stakeholder collaboration on complex social and environmental challenges. We also do capacity building and what we call field building work, which is contributing to the growth and expansion and effectiveness of the larger field that we call systems change. If you're into tweeting, we invite you to share learning and thoughts from today's webinar and tag us if you wish at We Are Co-Creative. And you could tag Hassan Batts at Doc Batts, D-O-C-B-A-T-T-S. I'm going to pass the mic now to Melissa Darnell to introduce herself and her role on our team, and then to our colleague Hassan, who will introduce himself and get our webinar started.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa. I'm so delighted to see all of you here today. I'm the one who has been emailing you and who sent the calendar request and also handles some of our social media. In addition to helping to support our virtual trainings, our in-person trainings, our webinars, and also to deliver some of those things and work. I do also some work on our projects. So I'll answer questions about that privately if you have any. Right now, I just want to be super brief and let you know that these are challenging times. I'm participating from my bedroom because my husband is home schooling my child out in the other part of my house where my office usually is. So I'm glad to be here with you all, and I thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Melissa. So my name is Hassan. You see a slide up there that has the bio information. Again, I really want to thank you guys for being here with us. This is a space where we're working to create a community at a time where we need one another. So I begin by saying we ground ourselves in the Ubuntu principles of I am because we are, therefore because we are I am. This is really about community. This is really about how do we create our new normal and continue to move forward, but also come to know one another during these times of social distancing, right? That we do not practice social isolation. So thank you for leaning in and for joining us on this journey. So the first thing that we're going to do is we want to get to know you a little bit, right? So we have this Slido. You see the browser right there? We want you to pull up Slido at slido.com and enter the code use of self. It's fairly simple because I was able to do it and I'm technologically challenged. So we want to know a little bit about you, how you self-identify. Tell us your name, your organization, where you're coming from, and one word, one value that consistently guides your work. So we want to know who's in the room as we move forward. We're going to really jump into the deep end with the information, but we want to know who's in the room and spend some time really understanding that. Okay, we have some folks responding. Welcome, welcome. And we have a lot of international folks with us, so if you could let us know where, some clarification on where you're located, that would be helpful. And then we want you to, on the poll, let's see what we get through there. How are we looking? Wow, we have a lot of diversity around the table.
All right, kia ora to the people from, looks like Auckland and a few other parts of New Zealand.
And again, we really want to set the stage and see who's with us and make sure we get the most out of our time together.
Hassan, as I'm looking at these, I'm also just present to coronavirus being being present in all these places too.
Right. Yeah, so we're talking about again with use of self, just keeping in mind how we show up and the idea of being present, that all of us show up and our realities show up. So in a sense, shattering that paradigm that you have to leave your baggage or leave a part of you at the door and compartmentalize. I don't know how to silence. Okay, so everyone can see that? Compassion, integrity, justice, listening, connection. One word we ask folks to share the value that sticks with them.
Hassan, I'm seeing mana on the cluster of values here. I'm wondering if one of our Kiwi friends would mind unmuting yourself and sharing what mana means, what it looks like.
Kia ora, my name's Luella from New Zealand. Mana is a Māori concept that we all have. We're all born with innate mana. It comes from those that have been before us, our ancestors, but it's also what we do in our own lives that increases our mana. Some people equate it to integrity, but it's more than that. And so mana driving me is the mana that everyone has, how we uplift all of that.
Thank you. So beautiful connection with use of self.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're looking to see what resonates. What ideas are resonating with folks? Based on your own experience, what is a key ingredient in use of self? The idea is, what do you bring to the table? What do you come to the table? Where's your understanding? Before we really get into describing it from our perspectives and sharing, in essence, grounding. So from your own experiences, what are some key ingredients? Humility and servant leadership, authenticity. And you can upvote items that resonate for you, or you can add new ones to the list. What are the ingredients that you think of that are effective?
Seeing authenticity come up a lot, Hassan.
Yeah, I can't see the entire list. Authenticity, being fully present, honesty. And there's a way to upvote them through clicking on them, correct?
Yep.
So you can either add new ones or you can upvote them so we can see what are the ones that are really resonating for folks. And authenticity is rising to the top. Can someone briefly share what they mean by authenticity, if they would unmute? What does that mean to you? Jean says authenticity means honesty to her. Thank you. All right, any last things folks want to add? Being fully present, passion, authenticity, grounding, leadership, vulnerability, awareness, deep listening, presence, choice, open mind, being gentle with me. Honesty comes up a bunch too. Honesty again.
Let's see what's rising to the top here.
Self-awareness. I think we have a robust and exciting agenda ahead of us based on this is perfect. So Russ, you want to step into introducing the elements for us?
Yeah. Before I go on, any reflections on what people saw there? Feel free to unmute yourself and just share verbally. Okay, so I'm going to go to, whoops, here we are.
And we do want to add, so you have full permission and encouragement to join us. This is co-learning. So we want you to contribute. This is a participatory process, whether it be through chat or, you know, when the opportunity arises, unmuting yourself and sharing.
All right, so I have been guilty at times. One thing I'm aware of in myself is I sometimes jump into content about a topic without saying what the topic actually is. And so part of my good practice of use of self and being aware of that was to say, oh, let's put a slide in here with some definitions of what we mean when we say use of self. And I think we have maybe a name missing here. Yeah, so I know in some countries, in the UK, for example, people will use the phrase self as instrument, the idea that I am an instrument of change and I can use myself consciously as an instrument and show up intentionally in whatever way is going to be helpful to the work that's at hand. We could say use of self as an instrument of change, whatever terminology works. But there are a number of definitions. These are the three that I found most compelling, particularly EDC Shores, where he says, conscious use of self is a way of approaching life that leads to increased awareness of one's unique gifts and the capacity to influence others. It is a necessary competency for people in positions where they are leading, coaching, and empowering others to act. And one of the things that resonates with me about ED's definition is it's a way of approaching life. So it's not just something that we just do at times and not other times, but we can consciously use ourselves at any point in our lives, in any situation, in any context, to support forward movement, to support increased awareness, to support movement collectively and individually toward equity, etc. So for those of you who are into theory, etc., it has its basis in Gestalt psychology and therapy. It has, I think, probably the longest practice in that area and in the practice of the field of organization development. One of the things as we've reviewed the literature is it really comes out of a paradigm of holism. Sometimes we think, oh, you know, as a leader, I'm somehow separate from the group, or as a facilitator, I'm standing apart from the group. But if we think about the holistic nature of any system, an intervener, whether you're a facilitator, a leader, or whoever, you can't really separate yourself from the system in which you're intervening. You are a part of that system. You're in that room, you're affecting the way that system is working. You're also contributing to what's not working in the system. And so there isn't this idea that somehow certain people are causing things to happen, but there's a holistic dynamic that's in play. And we can understand what's happening and the responsibilities at different levels of that system. There's also, in a lot of the definitions and literature on use of self, these values are expressed around things that we just saw. Presence, authenticity, dialogue, inclusion. And in dialogue particularly, there's an orientation toward approaches for working with others that are more dialogic and less diagnostic. So rather than me coming in, interviewing a bunch of people, deciding what is needed in a system in order to make change, we're making meaning together. We're gathering data together. We're analyzing the data together. we're making meaning of it together. And we're constructing meaning in a shared way that recognizes that the reality that we live in is in large part a reality that we've co-constructed and created together. So if we're going to shift that reality, we need to do it in dialogue, not with some people playing doctor and other people, sitting back in a patiency role. So at Co-Creative, when we started to think about this element of the work that we support, which we call collaborative innovation, and essentially what we spend most of our time doing is helping people who don't know each other and sometimes don't like each other come together to solve complex systemic problems. And most of that work is done in the form of networks. So multi-stakeholder, multi-sector collaboratives that are working on things like, how do we ensure that workers who are producing electronics components and products aren't being exposed to hazardous chemicals? How do we ensure that Native Hawaiian youth in the foster system in Hawaii, through the initiative that Jean, who's joined us here, is working on, Nakama Haloa, are connected to lasting networks of support that they can sustain and that can sustain them? How do we ensure that in the Tri-County area in Northwest Portland, that we are closing the racial equity gaps in kindergarten readiness, because kids are systematically disadvantaged in their education even before they've entered the educational system. So all of these things require us to think of how we lead, how we show up in systems, how we use ourselves as leaders. And it's not just about that system out there, it's about what's happening with us internally and how we're using our identity, how we're using our values, how we're using our difference, how we're using our sameness with others in the room to intentionally intervene and lead effectively. So we had identified four elements that we thought were components of use of self. This isn't necessarily consistent with the literature, but it is consistent with our experience and particularly the work we've been doing with system leaders who are leading these different kinds of initiatives. So the first one we just call awareness. And we started with this intentionally because without awareness, the other elements of use of self don't really matter, and in fact can be harmful. So I may be a person who rushes to action and I don't develop enough awareness about what's really going on, about how my identity is affecting other people in the room and things like that. And so when we talk about awareness, we're talking about developing awareness of what's happening at multiple levels of a system. So when I'm in a room with other people, I'm trying to be aware of what's happening inside me, both in my body, in my mind, but also in my spirit. I'm trying to be aware of what's happening at the group level. I'm also trying to be aware of what's happening in that larger system that we're working to change, whether that's the educational system, the foster care system, or some other system. And then if I'm paying attention to what's going on at multiple levels and I'm developing and deepening my awareness, I then get to the question of, okay, now what's my intention here? And Hassan and I will both share stories about these, but by intention, what we really mean is, what is the greater purpose that's guiding my choices about what I'm going to do to intervene in the system or to make a difference? Is my intention to disrupt what's happening in the group? Is my intention to take down a dominant system that's oppressing and marginalizing people systematically? Is my intention at this point to heal trauma and to help people to be able to cultivate hope for the future? I can have many different intentions in the same situation, but being clear about my intention helps me clarify in the moment and in the larger work, how I might best use myself. The third element we identified, we simply called choice, which is even if I'm clear about my intention and I'm developed a pretty deep awareness about what's happening at multiple levels of the system that I'm working in, I still have a range of choices for how to proceed. I might decide that the best thing to do is for me to leave the room. I might decide that, one of my options for intervening is to swear in front of the group about how angry I am at what's been happening. There are many, many choices that are available to us, and often we think of our work as consultants as helping people to increase their range of choice and not get stuck in the kind of habituated patterns of choice that they've operated from for many years. Because essentially, if people don't get to the point where they can create new choices and are able to make new choices for themselves, then all of our work around systems change isn't going to be anything. It's not going to amount to much. And then the fourth element we just identified as courage. And I'm not sure that this is the best name for this, but we decided that courage has to be here at some level, because I can be aware of what's happening. I can be really aware of what's happening. I can have a clear intention. I can even identify a choice. And at some point, if I don't do what I have to do inside myself, to take a risk, to make a leap, to say what needs to be said, to speak truth to power, whatever that is, then there's no expression of my awareness, my attention, and my choice. I'm not intervening. And so the courage to act, to take action, is something that I think is hard to teach, but it is something we can all learn and cultivate within ourselves. And I think Hassan will have stories about courage, and I will as well. And we're hoping to hear from you all as well as we go forward. So I want to offer, as we go forward in the webinar, on Slido, we'll activate an idea here. And it's going to be, well, it's basically an idea just means what we just did, where you're free to contribute and also upvote other things that folks have contributed. But we want to start to emerge from everyone on the call here what's coming up for you. So it's a pretty simple question. It could be a question. It could be something that you're aware of that's emerging inside yourself as you're participating in this webinar. It could be a reflection that you have on what we're sharing here. Whatever is coming up for you, feel free to drop it into the Slido poll. Again, it's slido.com. The event code is one word, use of self. And you'll be able to go in there. And Hassan and I, as we're sharing some of our experiences in use of self, will also see what's coming up here and be able to dynamically respond to some of it. Then after Hassan and I have shared some of our experiences, we're going to interview each other in the truest meaning of the word interview, to dig deeper into some of those experiences. And then we want to spend a good amount of time on the webinar today, kind of emerging and discussing things with the whole group that's participating. So I'll just cue up Hassan by saying, there are people whom you experience in life who you come away with a profound sense that they have made conscious choices about how to use themselves and have had the courage to act on those choices in ways that were risky and ultimately profound. And Hassan, for me, is one of those people. So I don't want to say more than just Hassan Batts is a person whom I deeply respect for his use of self. Hassan?
Thank you, Russ. So where I'm from, the response to that is I say, Russ, man, he's my guy, man. So You're my guy. I appreciate that. That really means a lot. And I do share. So this has been a journey for me, and is a journey, right? That was grounded in pain. So when we talk about use of self, for me, that is contradicts what the society really pushes, the imperative that we're pushed with. And we're really stressed to come from this place of neutrality, and oftentimes we're silenced. And so this has been a journey for me to make a conscious decision that I will not be complicit in my own oppression. And what does that look like for me? So I refuse to be complicit in my own oppression. So when we talk about standing up, I feel as though I have a duty to act at times, the oppression of myself and the oppression of others. So use of self for me starts with, who am I? And this is like the oldest question of time, depending on where you come from, right? Who am I? And for me, that really speaks to how do we, and this is through mentorship and relationships. We believe healing and wellness occurs in authentic relationships and in community. So this is, even when I use the language we're talking about from a community perspective, and who are we accountable to? So we're accountable to the community is the approach that I take. But who am I? And that means, what do I bring to the table? And once I begin to really ask myself that question, or we begin to ask ourselves that question, I think we show up different. What are my strengths? I mean, we live in this deficit-rich society that really pushes us to think of what we're not great at. But once we know what we're great at, and once we know our why, and once we know our purpose, we, for me on my journey, it helped me to show up different. It helped me to know that I'm a disruptor and that it's okay to disrupt. And again, it's grounded in liberation. So I refuse to be complicit in my oppression and the oppression of others. And I work from a space of something we call radical welcome. And I learned that from my experiences of knowing what rejection feels like, knowing what it feels like to have people try to silence you, know what it feels like to be pushed out, knowing what it feels like to feel unwelcomed. And I had this hunger and this dying need for welcome. And I realized if they were going to reject me, at least I wasn't going to be complicit in and contribute to the shaming and blaming of trying to be an imposter to show up in spaces. So use self is, I know who I am. I know what my goals are, and I know what I want. And when we walk into a room, we walk into space, we want to be clear on that and unapologetic, if that makes sense in that. So it's this ultimate question. I mean, Russ and I were talking about, I'll give you an example of today, just briefly to share. So we're all wrestling with, how do we manage this pandemic, right? And I'm dealing with the larger institutions, the gatekeeper institutions, the anchor institutions in our community that hold all the resources. But I'm connected to live, love, and engage with the community that's experiencing some severe suffering that often is at the bottom when it comes to a health crisis of any kind. And how do we meet those needs? So when I say use of self, I had to really be still, because I have many personalities and many roles, right? So I'm an executive, I'm in the spaces with these folks, but I had to say, you know what? I represent the people in my community. How do I do that? So we had to find a way to lift up the voices of those people. But it took, and we came up with a really unique strategy of creating videos on our phones, because the folks in our community were not listening. And I'm still talking about use of self. I just talk in circles sometimes. The folks in our community were not listening because of all the medical apartheid that had occurred, and didn't want to hear the public health campaign messages that were being put out there. So we said, how do we engage with people from a space that people can remain safe, that we can contribute to stopping the spread of this virus, with consistent messaging from credible messages. And I had to step away from that neutrality position, and I had to say, I'm a Black male in this community that is a credible message, that has connections to, I have a program where we work with gang members. So we said, you know what, we got to put some of these gang members in videos talking about how to stop this. We had to use what we had and use who we are and the values that the people and connections that we have to contribute to it. So that's just a modern day example of it, like a current day example of it, and what it looks like. So again, with this hunger for radical welcome and not to be a bystander as these things occur, the question is, what role do we play? What gifts and talents have you been blessed with? What are the things that you bring to the table? And as one of my mentors tells me, she always says, you are perfect, whole, and complete. And how do I step into that? Through a place of authenticity, because we have a leadership program that we work with, and we talk about leadership is the leaders that we have are not the leaders that we need. The level of leadership that we need is centered around vulnerability and authenticity, and I see that word kept showing up. So what does it look like to be fully present? What does it look like to be fully present? What does it look like to step away from that paradigm of professionalism that we're taught in school, and to understand what does it mean to move from our heads and our hearts? We are the leaders of today. I like that. Adam said we are the leaders of today. Yeah, so especially during times of crisis. You know, we are, many of us are storytellers at heart, and we say everyone has a story to tell, and I got distracted. Refusing to be complicit in my own oppression is so powerful. It brings up choice and courage for me. Thank you. That's from Melissa. I'm just gonna read some of the notes we have because they're coming through. I'll be sending out a log of the Slido questions. So what does that look like and the choices that we have? We say everyone has a story. Everyone has a story, and how do we step into and lean into that story? And my journey was centered around the moment that I began to accept that. The moment that I began to accept that. So even oftentimes we're shamed and blamed into being these imposters and seeking perfection. And use of self is really around knowing that we are perfect, we are whole, we are complete. And how do we step into that space from a place of authenticity? And it's also, for me, has a huge restorative practice piece to it. Because I know that I've harmed my community. And how do I show up and repair that harm if I'm not honest about what I bring to the table? So how do we treat people, those amongst us, when we don't show up as our best selves? Is a huge part of it. And it's centered around a conscious decision making. I often say to myself, my wife and I were talking about this earlier, when I enter a room, I want people to know what I stand for, whether they disagree or they agree. It's centered around consistency. I want people to know what I stand for, because I am a, many of us carry privilege, right? How do we acknowledge that privilege and utilize that privilege to be the change we want to see in the world? Because it's easy to ignore. But how do we lean into it and maximize it? Any questions at this point? I want to take a moment and just check in with in our interconnected world, we're so often concerned with things that we are not. We are. What I'm hearing is grow. Grow where you're planted. I love that. Grow where you're planted. We spend a lot of time, again, looking at our deficits, allowing other people to define us. Or right? I spend a lot of time doing that rather than acknowledging. I have a rich history that some of my bio talked about it. I say that I share that I'm a prison survivor. I came up through. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s. I mean, I'll keep it brief, right? I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s, and I survived a lot of difficult time. And what I learned is that in order to be successful, I had to stand on my experiences. What does that mean? The same skills and talents and traits that helped me to survive as an undersized kid in Brooklyn are what I use in a boardroom. I know how to mobilize people. I have charisma. I know how to persuade. Those are survival skills that I developed. So as a survivor, we work with other survivors and we say, you know, stop allowing people to tell you you're worthless and see who you are. And how do you transition those survival skills or those skills, whether we're talking about life or death, those skills that you have that have made you successful in life, how do you maximize them? How do you use those as your gifts and your talents to the world? And into them and stand this. And as I always share, I have a mentor that constantly tells me, you're perfect, whole, and complete. and that's where that space generates from. So, all right, I feel like I'm talking, so I want to open the floor and see what questions, what's resonating for you guys. We are the sum of all the parts. Our experiences are part of our growth. We can't ignore them. We can't ignore them. We always talk about, we want all of you to show up. When we're working with teams, we talk about self-care and compassion and team care and compassion. And what's critical is that everyone in the room knows that we are the sum of all our parts, or greater than the sum of all our parts. So when you're working with teams, if someone's mother's wrestling with leukemia, that's going to come into the room. So when we tell them leave it at the front door, it's going to come in. So we invite people to bring all of who they are to the table from a place of compassion, and still accountability exists, but we have to, as Gene Fox said, grow where we're planted. Or Margaret said, grow where we're planted.
So Hassan, one of the things that's come up in Slido here from Cardina is wondering how to navigate clarifying intention when people are resistant to change.
Say that again?
Wondering how to navigate clarifying intention when people are resistant to change.
Wondering how to navigate clarifying, say it one more time, resistance?
How to navigate clarifying my intention when people are resistant to change. So I was reflecting on that and thinking, well, people's resistance is, well, actually, we're going to have a webinar coming up about how actually when we think of things like fear, resistance, conflict, and failure, we tend to think of them as kind of uniformly bad things, but there are some benefits and positive aspects of those, right? Failure, we learn what's not going to work. We learn more clearly what's really needed, right? So we intervened and it didn't work, and now we have a better understanding of what might work. But resistance is one of those things that we tend to think of as a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes, there's great wisdom in resistance. And the resistance might be, we tried this before and it didn't work, but nobody's listening to me because the people in power think that, you know, this is the greatest idea since sliced bread, and they're not listening to me that we've actually tried this before. But I would separate that from our intention, right? Which is you and I becoming clear in ourselves. What are we about? What is our greater purpose? What is our greater intention for the work that we're engaged in right now? And that's separate from, and that clarity can be really powerful, regardless of what resistance is you're facing.
Yeah, and we're gonna encounter, right? We're gonna encounter resistance. We're gonna encounter snapback, and so two questions that I found on my journey that I ask is, one is how have I contributed to this when we encounter conflict, rather than, you know, blaming and shaming. What role? How have I contributed to it? Because it's always about self and others. It's back to that emotional intelligence use of self that we talk about. How have I contributed to this conflict? Is a burning question that I often ask myself.
So I'll share a little bit about some of my experience with use of self, Hassan, and then let's jump into our interview. Does that work?
Sounds good.
So I guess my evolution around awareness started because I didn't speak till I was 4 years old. And then I didn't speak much until I was 14. What I did do is I watched people. And it's amazing what you can learn just by shutting your mouth and opening your ears and eyes. And so I attribute some of my intuition to the fact that I was observing and listening for much of my early life rather than kind of expounding and stating my opinions. But there was also a part of my upbringing which was in a Norwegian town in southeastern Minnesota, which is a very kind of so in this community, personal pride was heavily discouraged. And anything that looked like you were being cocky or you were being too proud of yourself got cut down. And I know in New Zealand, the phrase is tall poppies, right? When you see a tall poppy, you cut it down. And so anything that looks like arrogance or pride or whatever gets cut down. And so I also developed a part of myself that's very self-effacing. And it was when I was in my master's in organization development program, we had some intense weekend and I was getting a ride back to my house from a couple of classmates. And I was sitting in the back seat of the car and 3 words came into my head like a bolt of lightning. And the words were, I am ambitious. And it was the first time in my life I'd ever even associated that word with me. Because I'd been so self-effacing, so, just like cover up what you want because it's not good to show what you want. But to say I was actually ambitious, that was crazy, right? And so, so I think there is an element of awareness, which is that was in me for my whole life, right? That subordinated kind of repressed ambition. And the release of energy that I felt at the point that I could actually say those words to myself was powerful and galvanizing. And before I realized that, I was showing up in situations where I was trying to impress people and trying to, get some recognition for what I was doing, but at the same time be super humble and super self-effacing and not really express what was going on with me. And that was really unhealthy, right? So the ambition was there, but it was showing up in really, really unhealthy ways, like a monkey on my back that would jump out and do things that I'd be like, what the hell, monkey? And at the point that I connected with that part of myself, I felt more whole, more of my whole self. And so I think, Hassan, as you were talking, there's an element of recognizing our wholeness and perfection and completion. And that's not in conflict with the idea that there can be parts of our whole selves that have been repressed by ourselves, by our society, right? So how I always have to show up at work as a person of color and look a certain way and talk a certain way, because that's what society is asking for me, and it's repressing the other parts of myself that are also part of me that I also want to express. There was a point, courage has come up in some of the themes here on Slido. In fact, I think some of the top comments here. And my own experience around courage was I was afraid of public speaking, and I was also afraid of heights. And interestingly, I'd never associated those two things, but the physical experience I had when I was speaking in public in front of a room, or when I was up high, like on a Ferris wheel or something like that, the physical manifestation was really similar. And there was a point at which, and the mental experience was similar as well, which was I'd have all these kind of crazy thoughts running through my head, like, oh, Russ, you're going to screw up. You're going to say something stupid, or you're going to fall down this hill and die, or whatever. And I was at a retreat, actually, on use of self, maybe not coincidentally, with Charlie and Edie Seashore. And during the retreat, about halfway through on a Wednesday afternoon, a bunch of us went out to a swimming hole, and I climbed up to, I think, about maybe a 5 meter, 15-foot rock over the swimming hole. And I fully intended to jump, right? I was aware that this was my opportunity. I set the intention to jump. I got up there. I was making the choice, okay, I'm going to do this. And then these thoughts started coming to my head. Okay, I'm going to land on somebody. No, I'm going to hit a rock on the way down, or I'm going to go in the water and go too deep, and I'm going to hit the bottom, and I won't be able to come up, or it was crazy. And at some point, it was my gut that said to my head, shut up and jump. And then I jumped. And then later in New Zealand over Lake Taupo, I was doing a bungee jump, which was the next challenge, right? It went from a 3-meter drop to, I don't know what it was, probably a 50-meter drop or something like that. I had never done anything like this in my life, but I had a similar experience. I got to the edge. I was about to fall forward, and my head just started going crazy with all this talk about how the rope is going to break. I'm going to, you know, slam into the bottom and break my neck or whatever. And it was my gut that said, okay, just relax and fall. And that's what I did. And so in some ways, my experience of courage has been letting go of the kind of neck up part of myself that wants to completely understand and analyze and get to some kind of perfect solution before I act, to this more embodied kind of sense of self, which is my gut has wisdom and it knows when action needs to be taken, and I can act from my gut and work more instinctively. And interestingly, that's showing up in a really powerful way in my public speaking, in my facilitation of groups and things like that. So at least with awareness and courage, those are two experiences of how those elements have shown up for me. So let's just pause here. Any verbal reflections? I know there's things in Slido, and Hassan and I will look at those as we go to our interview here, but any reflections on what's coming up for folks right now?
Hi, this is Ketura Felix. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you so very much. This is such a rich conversation, and I just want to say I have to hop off in a minute, but before I leave, I just wanted to say that this is just such a powerful way of being and acting in the world. And so that's and it resonates deeply with me. So that's what I want to share, and just to express my appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have can you hear me?
Yeah, what's your name?
This is Jean Fox.
Hi, Jean.
Welcome,
Jean Fox. Hi. I can relate to your story. I was both afraid of heights and afraid to speak to for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned. But I was also, when you were talking, I was thinking thinking is one thing, and then your action is after your thinking. So at some point, you have to choose. You have to make a choice. Thinking is inside and action is outside.
Mm-hmm.
So then you come back to intention. What is your intention? So your intention it's almost like they're inside of each other. You have an intention, you have all these thoughts around your intentions, and you can stay inside and keep in that space, or you can let that go and choose to act. Once you act, then you're releasing the fear. You go, oh, well, that worked.
Or it didn't.
That's right.
Or it didn't. But you learned something. You had an experience.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, and I like that. You've released it, right? Because that energy starts to build up in you. And if you don't act, that gets subordinated or repressed or diverted in some way, right?
Comes anxiety, and I used to have all kind of asthma attacks as a kid and things like that from not communicating, from not acting, from not releasing.
So Hassan, what's coming up for you?
What you brought up, well, a couple things. I too had a fear of heights and a fear of public speaking, and learned to lean into fear in a similar way. I'm not jumping into a pool of water, but you know, I jump on stage, I'll grab a mic, I'll do some public speaking. one of the things that really resonated for me as you were talking was, I learned later in life that people of privilege teach their children to fail forward.
Mm.
And I wasn't taught that. So they're taught to make mistakes. So I began to function in that way for myself, for the people around me, in the organizations I work with my children, is that we're here to learn, and you learn through doing, and I want you to take risks and make mistakes. So we were taught to be cautious, and I think that's part of that oppression that we talk about. You know, through racism and all kind of isms that we experience, we think we have to be perfect. And the day that we begin to learn that we don't have to be perfect, and that we can take risks, and that we can jump, and that we can make mistakes, and that we'll be okay because we know what we bring to the table, then we won't show up at a job for 40 years that's killing us. We won't stay in a relationship that's killing us, because we realize that there are other options. And I'm not saying immediately people are just going to leave their job, but you know, we begin to develop exit strategies. When we begin to make choices and think about how does it feel here? And you talked about the gut, right? So how does it feel here in your head? How does it feel in your heart? And how does it feel in your gut? Our bodies, our minds, and our hearts tell us when they're not aligned with the decisions we're making. So we work with a lot of organizations and individuals that are decision makers, and we ask them, how is this policy, practice, procedure going to impact the most vulnerable amongst us? And although it's hard to get people to understand that, they get there. What's even harder is to say, how is this going to impact you? How is this going to impact you, your ability to sleep, your ability to eat, your ability to function? How does your body feel about the decision you're making? How does your body feel in certain relationships? So as you were talking, I was really thinking about, how do we learn to trust ourselves? And what are the experiences that taught me to trust myself? And oftentimes it's failing. And not only failing, but learning that everybody fails, everybody makes mistakes, and our failings don't make us a failure. And once we overcome that fear, how wide the world gets for us.
Yeah, that whole thing, what we've noticed is in systems change and process work in general, there are these heavily kind of Western and white dominant values that that dictate the way work should be done, right? So, and they show up as urgency, perfectionism, hierarchy, either or thinking, getting it right, you know, those kinds of things. And the thing is, those don't work for anybody, right? They especially don't work for people of color, and they don't work for anybody.
Don't work for anyone. That's right.
It reminds me of a talk Sharif Abdullah did. Sharif is the author of a terrific book called Creating a World That Works for All. And he said, you know, when I was growing up in a rough neighborhood in my city in New Jersey, by the time I was a teenager and I was getting out of high school, I realized I had decided the world doesn't work for Black people. And I knew that was true because I saw the evidence all around me, right? He said, and then I went into college and I started working with poor people in Appalachia. And I said, okay, the world doesn't work for poor people and Black people. And then he said, I started working with global leaders who had a lot of power, and some of them had a lot of money, and they were really unhappy, and they were really alienated and disconnected from other human beings. And he said, that's the point at which I realized the way we've designed the world, it doesn't really work for anybody. Now, it works better, certainly in some ways for certain people, right? But this sense of like fear and disconnection and alienation and lack of, you know, honoring my whole self, I see so many people in so many contexts experiencing that. In some ways, I feel like use of self can be a form of reconciliation and healing for ourselves, just to appreciate the gifts that we each have, and to be able to bring those forward.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, because it impacts our health and our life outcomes. It's not working for anyone, and we feel it. Our bodies feel it, and we carry that pain. So what would our world look like? You know, just imagine a world where we all showed up fully present, fully authentic. or even if, so for myself, I didn't even start in the world. I started with myself, and then in one relationship that I consciously chose, I said, I'm going to be true, honest, and authentic with my best friend. My fears, I mean, my experience is that few people have people in this world that they're completely honest with. I'm going to put the shame aside and be honest with him around anything and everything. And it was a relief just to have one person that I could text, that I could call, and I could say, I was afraid, I loved her, I didn't want to lose my job, or whatever it may be. What would our world look like if we had at least one person that we were authentic with?
And the one word that's coming up for me, Hassan, is vulnerability.
Vulnerability.
Right. The ability, this enough safety, enough courage, enough will to be vulnerable in front of a group. Sometimes I see people facilitating, and I know that person's getting a little lost about what to do here. And at that moment, it may be that the best thing to do is to say, I'm lost, group. What do we do?
That's right. Look at a map. Ask for directions.
So Hassan, you've talked about the body awareness a bit. Can you share more about how that shows up for you? And then I'd like to share a quick story about how I observed that in another facilitator. And then let's open up and ask other folks what they're thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Russ, because for me, even as a child, it showed up in my body first, I think, right? Or that's where I'd see the symptoms. I briefly shared earlier, I had a severe asthma. I was what you call a super utilizer. Like almost weekly, I was hospitalized for asthma attacks. And it was centered around not communicating. And my mother really had to push me, like, I need you to communicate. Tell me what's on your mind. I be having these asthma attacks. And she got to my mother was a nurse. So I don't know if she read this in an article somewhere or just in her Black mother wisdom, she decided, and I recall this, I'm about 6, 7 years old, and I'm huffing and I'm puffing, and you know, she's holding me and I'm feeling like I'm gonna die. This is gonna sound insane. And she's like, you gotta get this out. She's like, I'm not taking you to the hospital anymore. You gotta communicate what's going on. And I'm crying and I'm huffing and I'm puffing. And she's like, you're gonna die with that in you if you don't let it out. And I was and I just said, I hate him. And I just started telling her I hate my brother and about us fighting all the time. But I recall it even as an adult. And I didn't have asthma attacks after that. However, I developed deforming eczema that my whole skin would be scarred up. And as I got older, I learned again that if I didn't express myself, if I didn't have authentic, if I wasn't honest, if I held stuff in, it would show up in my body. So from my asthma as a child to my eczema as a teenager to as a young adult, anxiety attacks. It always showed up in my first marriage. If I didn't communicate, I'd be in the car and I'd just have a panic attack rather than say how I felt. So I was blessed to be surrounded by some elders, and I've learned some beautiful lessons from retired people and elders. They say what's on their mind. They do what they want. I have a retired friend, she told me, I don't go to any meeting that I don't want to be in. Even if you have to go to that meeting, just being honest with yourself, like, I really don't want to be there. I can't wait till the day comes that I don't have to be in that meeting, has been freeing for me. It shows up in my body. My arms will be covered in sores. My neck will be covered in sores. I'll have panic attacks if I'm not self-aware, conscious, and honest about the relationships that I'm in, the decisions that I make, you know, and we can deal with things to a certain level. You know, I have to have relationships and work relationships that I don't want to have at times with organizations, but I limit them. And sometimes it reaches a point where I have to stand up and walk out and leave because I know what it's going to do to me. So I do believe that there are health and life outcomes that come from that constant stress, constant shame, constant concealing what we want, who we are. And there's a journey, there's a path to freedom and liberation.
That experience sounds like what people refer to as toxic stress, right?
Yeah.
So my experience was I was running a part of a gathering as a facilitator, and this was a gathering of people who do facilitation for the most part. And so I was being a good facilitator, right? And I was proceeding with a part of the planned meeting that we had all agreed on. And I had a sense somewhere in my body that this wasn't quite the right thing to be doing in the moment because of what had emerged in the previous day with the group. But I proceeded with the plan, and a very white thing of me to do, frankly, right? I'm just going to go with the sequential, planned actions here. And there was one person in the group who was standing up behind her chair and kind of moving around. And so I was confirming, is this what we want to do? And this person whom I'll name and ask her forgiveness later if she doesn't like this, but it was Brookine Gatewood at Emergence Collective, whom I think some of you probably know. But Brookine paused and she looked at me and she said, something's in my body that doesn't feel right about doing that. I think we need to do something else. And I don't know what it is, and I haven't quite verbalized it, but I think we need to just slow down and step back and see what wants to emerge in this group. And so the group kind of sat with that for a few seconds, and then I asked the group, does that feel right for this moment? Does that feel good for this moment? And the group said yes. And we went into one of the most beautiful parts of the meeting. And it was because Brookine was able and willing to really listen to what was happening in her body. And then to the best she could in that moment, verbalize that bodily intuition in a way that shifted the entire group's plan. So I'm wondering, and it may be on this topic of kind of bodily awareness and how we develop it and how we pay attention to it, or another topic, but I just want to open it up here. And feel free to unmute yourself. We may get a little bit of people talking at the same time, but that's cool, it's okay. If you also want to go back into Slido and add what's coming up for you and do some upvoting of things that resonate with you, that's another way to engage. But what's coming up for folks? Anyone who wants to share verbally?
Yeah, Adam here. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Hassan and Russ and Co-Creative. Yeah, I've been engaging in a practice called focusing. It's a clinical practice from integral coaching. And that's about connecting the somatic, like the body intelligence, to the emotional intelligence, to the cognitive intelligence. And one of the things that I really am hearing really loudly from the conversations that I've been having in the chat and everything is that I think authenticity for me is about bringing all of those voices in and recognizing all of them as legitimate, even the ones that come from places I'm ashamed of or I'm not happy about. But by not hearing those voices, they become much stronger in me. And when I hear those voices, I find that they loosen. And there's a kind of softening and a forgiveness towards myself. You know, I grew up in the UK in the 70s and 80s, so I guarantee there's a lot wrong with how I think and see the world sometimes, but it's not my thinking. And when I resist those voices, I am that person. But when I really kind of sense into it through the practice of focusing and allow all of those voices to be present and just hang out with them and allow them to be seen and heard, there's a softening that happens that really allows me to integrate more. And it's kind of bodyfulness as opposed to mindfulness, which is something that's been really powerful for me because there is a really, really incredible nervous system that we have that allows us to navigate complexity and people in a way that just the cognitive space cannot match, in my experience anyway. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, there's a saying, you'll get what you resist, right? Because resistance, if nothing else, is a form of energy, right? And we're giving that thing that we're actively resisting energy. It kind of reflects back to Hassan, what you were sharing about the physical manifestations of when you weren't being honest and you weren't being yourself.
I had an old head that used to tell me, what we resist persists. I think that's the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we resist persists. So thank you for sharing that. When you brought the voices, what resonated for me with that is we always talk about the voices that we hear and learning to practice discernment, because oftentimes people are functioning off of like their uncle's voice from when they were in first grade is whispering in their ears. You know, like how do we learn to really be in tune with ourselves and with the positive people that we've had in our lives, the voices of those folks, rather than the supervisor we had or the teacher with the red pen. I mean, to this day, I still have difficulty writing because I see that red pen mark, you know? How do we learn to filter those voices and lift up and amplify the ones of the people that have supported and encouraged us in our successes? So thank you for bringing that up. That's a great point.
Others?
Hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here and thank you for your stories. I'm part of a provincial network here in Saskatchewan, and so some of the work and how we work is similar to our discussion here. And so I've just
Could you share your name?
Nofa.
Nofa, I know.
Yeah, I might say Tracy on because I'm using her account. But I just been thinking about the power of stories, and we talk a lot about bringing our whole selves. I think it's contrary, like you said, to what the professional world teaches us, that we need to leave our personal hat and our personal experiences at the door. And to some extent, that's healthy. But I think we talk a lot about the importance of bringing our whole self. And Hussein, as you're talking about your story, and I think about like all of the isms that I've experienced in my life. But when I'm able to relate and increases my empathy, I feel that those stories and experiences that are tough are a privilege. So the privilege of really knowing what it feels like to be in those tough spots. And I think as facilitators, it helps me without saying anything and how I respond that I've been there and I get it to a certain extent. So it's just a privilege, I think, to experience some of the things that we have each experienced.
Thank you. And to survive them, right? I mean, that's where grit comes from, to know that we're still standing. And they say fall down 8, get up 9.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I was working in a nonprofit organization during the economic recession in 2008, 2009, and we had to cut back on a lot. We had to make all kinds of drastic changes. And at the end of the day, what we had earned was the right to keep going. But that was worth a lot. I wanted to hear from either Kendall or someone who upvoted Kendall's item here in Slido about a sense of fear or dread that courage can't be taught, because that's seemingly the most difficult part and what gets in the way of my success too often. Is there somebody who'd be willing to share any reflections on that?
This is Heather. Show you myself while I'm talking. I don't know that it can't be taught, but my experience personally and and working with others is that the increments are much smaller than we would like them to be, right? So it's much less about, I don't know how to describe it. You know, you you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? It's not, you don't take on the biggest thing, but some aspect of inner knowing that allows you to take even a minute step is enough practice to then encourage the next step. And that by the time you've done that a few times, lo and behold, you've done something. But you don't start from, wherever you start and take the biggest leap possible. It's too big. And So yeah, so that's been my experience. Like, what's the one thing I can do that feels maybe it feels a little bit dangerous, a little risky, but I can survive it. Okay, I'll do that. Oh, look at that. I'm still alive. Okay. What did I learn from that? And then the next thing comes, oh, what else can I do? And so, and on it goes. And then you look back and go, whoa, I really covered a lot of terrain, but you don't start out with, I'm gonna do it all at once. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you for
Yeah,
that.
and of course, I made the claim that courage can't be taught. I could totally be wrong. As Heather noted, it certainly can be built and cultivated and developed and acquired over time.
And we do want to add that courage looks different for different people. I think that's part of what Heather was saying also, right? Sometimes it's courageous just to get dressed in the morning for some folks because of their circumstances. Whereas others will really disrupt systems. Some people just showing up and just being present and just making it through another day in that moment is the most courageous thing that they have. So our courage is really collective is how I like to look at it. So when I have more, I give more. And then no moments when I don't, I can pull from, kind of like co-facilitators, right, Russ?
Yeah.
If I'm humbling, I can be silent and you'll step up. So I view courage in a similar sense. It's all about community.
It strikes me, Heather and Hassan, from what you just said, I think the biggest barrier to my own use of self, my own effective use of self, has been my ideal self. The way I think I should be, right? And then I try to be that, and I'm all the things that people didn't list on that list, right? I'm inauthentic, or I'm somehow not operating from a really congruent intent, right? Because I'm trying to show up as this thing that I'm actually not. And in some ways, the most powerful experience has been showing up as who I am and openly expressing what I think and feel and what I'm experiencing. Those have been the most powerful interventions I've done. Let me share a few more things. And we're going to end with these questions, if that's okay. In the deck that you'll find here, there's this, oddly enough, I'm going to quote the work of Charlie Munger, who is a close compatriot of Warren Buffett, the very successful investor. But Charlie Munger has a concept he calls a lattice work of models. Basically, to understand any situation or challenge, he has a collection of, I think it's 70 or so models. And he basically filters through his observations to try to make sense of what's going on using these different models. And so at Co-Creative, we've drawn on some of these different models that are on the screen here. But I think in terms of building awareness, it really helps to have a variety of lenses through which we can look at any given situation. Because there are really powerful lenses like power itself as a lens, or race. And if overused and if used in every situation, they can also be distorting and unhelpful. And so we have resources here that relate to a variety of ways of seeing a system and gathering information and making sense of what's happening there. But I wanted to call out one in particular that some of us are familiar with from Edie Seashore, who was a pioneer in the field of organization development. This is not a kind of social justice framework. It is a use of self framework. And Edie talks about this intersection of awareness of choice and attribution of outcomes. And the idea here being that over time, as responsible kind of interveners in the system, we really want to move toward a greater sense of responsibility, which is I'm attributing outcomes to choices that I'm making in the moment, and I'm aware that I'm making choices. This is one lens. It's obviously not the best lens when you're talking about things like systemic racism and inequity and things like that. But as I think about my own use of self, I think, as Hassan, you said earlier, what's my role in this? How am I contributing to what's happening here? What other choices might I need to make? It's not about self-blame, and it's not about kind of internalizing poverty or oppression or racism. In this model, it's about widening my range of choice and taking responsibility where I can for what's happening. So if we could, let's push out, I don't know if, Melissa, if these are 1 or 2 questions or how this is structured in Slido, but we're really curious just to capture takeaways. This might be different than what folks shared in the previous Slido poll, but this is also a gift to all of us to hear what other people are taking away from the session, so we can share those as well.
Snow, thank you for sharing that. Snow said, acknowledging I am ambitious. I think oftentimes we're like, we're told to repress those kind of ideas, right? I am ambitious.
Yeah, I feel very related when Russ shared that phrase. And I think sometimes my silence is also due to over self-awareness, because before I started to talk, I feel my body temperature raise or reduced. I feel my body is shaking, my voice is shaking, and it's not a good idea to talk. And sometimes it's because that I understand both sides, and those controversial ideas become neutral, so that I will say, oh, I don't have an opinion.
Yeah, I know, Snow, I have that same tendency, and it feels a lot more safe and comfortable, right? Well, I appreciate whoever contributed encouragement, because I am sensing that's sorely needed in the world right now. Great. Melissa, you want to wrap us up here?
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank everybody again, and we want to just offer.
You sound a little distorted, Ross.
I wanted to thank everyone again for being here and for participating in the rich conversation with us. And I put it in the chat, but I want to remind everybody that I'll be sending out an email soon with the deck, the richness that came from the Slido, the video recording of this, and some other tools and resources, including our resource on the 4 elements of use of self that we discussed earlier. I also want to invite you to check out our website. We have recently redesigned the training portion of that, and we're really excited for folks to see the ways in which we are transitioning some of our work to virtual opportunities, to be in communion and relationship with one another, and mutual learning opportunities like this. Our next one, as you can see on the screen there, is on April 7th, How to Design Virtual Meetings for Clarity and Momentum. So we hope that you'll consider joining us for that. And connect with us on Twitter, email me, let us know how we can support the good work that you're doing in the world. It would be really wonderful to continue this conversation offline.
And thank you to our co-host Hassan Batts. You can find more about Hassan and his work at hassanbatts.com. And we'll include a link to Hassan's website and Twitter handle in the email as well. Hassan, any final thoughts?
Thank you, guys. I in the notes, it was just beautiful to meet you guys. It is refreshing even to tell our stories and to listen to other stories. So I appreciate you guys tuning in, especially during this time of this challenging time we're in. We are the leaders of our time, and we are being our new normal. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.